My wife asked if she could have a special romantic dinner with another man, and I just smiled. I smiled not because I found it funny, but because in that moment, everything I felt died inside me. I said, "Sure, enjoy it, it'll be your last as my wife." And I left. I left before she could answer, because nothing she said in that moment could change what I had just felt, the end. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't beg. I just left, taking with me what little remained of our story, the part that still made me believe she would choose me. But she didn't. And when you truly love someone, all you hope for is to be chosen back. Love doesn't survive on its own. It demands reciprocity. And in that moment, seeing the sparkle in her eyes when she mentioned another man's name, I knew, I was no longer her first choice. Maybe not even her second. And maybe not for a long time. I thought it was just curiosity. A passing delusion. A silly provocation, the kind we hear and respond to with a weary sigh. But there was desire in her voice. A disguised desire for freedom. For, I need to rediscover myself. For, it's not about you, it's about me. The kind of phrase that precedes chaos. The kind of phrase that, once uttered, cannot be taken back. When a woman asks her husband if she can go out with another man, romanticizing a date, opening the door to something that destroys homes, what she really wants is permission to cheat without carrying the guilt. She didn't just want dinner. She wanted to know if she could leave me without consequences. And even though she later said it was nothing more than an innocent dinner, I saw it in her eyes, she had already gone too far. Dinner was just the beginning. The fall was already underway. For days I sifted through memories, trying to pinpoint the moment I lost her. A specific night, a gesture I failed to make, a misplaced word. But the betrayal didn't spring from nowhere. It grew in the routine. In the awkward silences. In the lack of conversation. In the small oversights. I was no longer the man she admired. And she was no longer the woman who looked at me as if proud to be by my side. But I was there. Every day. Steadfast. Loyal. Present. Even when she was gone. Even when she was flirting with absence. She went. She had dinner with him. And I didn't stop her. I let her go like someone signing a sentence. Because true love doesn't beg for presence. And even though it hurt like a gunshot to the chest, I needed to understand, those who want to stay don't ask permission to leave. When she returned that night, her perfume was different. The sparkle in her eyes was different. And even though she said it was just dinner, there was something different in her step. An arrogant lightness. An almost rehearsed silence. She thought I wouldn't notice. But anyone who's been whole with someone feels when they start to become half. And I was becoming nothing. In the days that followed, she distanced herself, unaware that I was watching everything. The messages exchanged under the pillow. The smile when she looked at her phone. The rush to leave. The excuses. Her hair done to meet a friend. And yet, I remained silent. Not out of cowardice. But because, deep down, I wanted to see how far she would go. How far her courage to destroy everything we'd built would go. And she went far. She fell. And she fell badly. The man she risked everything for. She didn't want anything serious. It was a flash in the pan. It was vanity, ego, adrenaline. When reality hit, he disappeared. Without explanation. Without goodbye. And she was left alone. She came to me weeks later, trying to sew up what she had torn with her own hands. But there's some fabric that, once torn, is no longer fit to clothe two. She cried. She begged for forgiveness. She said she understood everything now. That the problem wasn't me. It was her. It had always been her. Her and this obsession with seeking out what she already had inside. This insatiable need to feel desired by others to remember I loved her. She said she had no idea how much she would lose for so little. But by then it was too late. I followed. Because love shouldn't hurt to exist. I found a place of comfortable silence. A woman who looks at me with serene eyes, who doesn't need to test me to know I'm hers. Who doesn't question my love to feel alive. With her, I understood the value of a fearless touch, a conversation without masks, an affection without demands. A love that has no plateaus, only growth. There is no anxiety when love is clear. And yet, when the other woman came back begging, I didn't scream. I didn't humiliate her. I just listened. Because sometimes the greatest punishment comes not with anger, but with calm. The calm of someone who finally understands that you don't lose what's gone. You only lose what you wanted to keep. I forgave. Because forgiveness frees the giver more than the receiver. But forgiveness is not a bridge. It's not a return ticket. It's the closing of a cycle. And there, I closed it. Today she lives surrounded by ghosts. The silence of her house is noisy. Memories weigh heavy. The bed is cold. The days are long. She lost me. And more than that, she lost who she was when she loved me. Because no one emerges from betrayal the same as the one who entered. She believed she would find more out there, but all she found was a reflection of her own emptiness. And even if I tried to go back, there's no more room. Because now, when I think of love, I see different eyes. Different smiles. Different future. But to this day, I sometimes wonder, at what point exactly did she trade me? When exactly did she believe that I would just be an obstacle in her path and not the reason for it? That question, still has no answer. But the following story might show you. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize cheating, ever. The stories you will hear are fictional, but inspired by real-life situations that show, without filter, how betrayal corrodes, destroys, and leaves deep scars. Each narrative carries a clear message: whoever chooses to betray, chooses to lose. Get ready. What's coming next is a story. Shocking, intense, and impossible to forget. They met in a modest cafe, amid the muffled sound of cups clinking and the constant hum of life happening outside, where no one imagined that in that instant a story would be born that would seem handcrafted. His name was Ethan, hers Claire. He wore a white shirt, with no intention of appearing special, and her hair was loose, slightly messy from the morning wind, which, for him, was precisely what made everything about her so absurdly real. The conversation didn't begin with charm or flourishes. It began because he accidentally bumped into the book she was reading, offering a hurried and sincere apology, and she smiled, a simple smile, the kind that disarms and invites without needing to say much. That's where it all began. It wasn't a cinematic beginning, but it was enough for each of them to gradually become the other's home. In the months that followed, their encounters became routine, and routine became comfort. Ethan had a restrained way of loving, the kind that observes silently and cares without fanfare. Claire was more intense, enjoying small gestures, lingering kisses in the middle of the afternoon, the feeling of being noticed even without asking. And he noticed. It was in the way he'd pull out her chair for her without realizing it, the way he'd wait for her to finish speaking before commenting, the way he'd never waver when she spoke about something only she considered important. They learned each other's language with patience and respect. It wasn't a flaming passion, it was a steady ember, the kind that keeps an entire house warm without anyone seeing the fire. After 2 years of dating, talk of sharing a roof arose, and it wasn't long before they were packing books, paintings, and dreams into cardboard boxes. The apartment was small, with a living room that caught morning light and a bedroom where the two shared more than space. They shared good days and bad, tiredness and hopes. The kitchen became a stage for improvised recipes and heartfelt laughter, and every object in the house seemed to tell their story: the cracked mug no one wanted to throw away, the plant she said he didn't water properly, the blanket on the sofa that preserved entire Sundays of movies and silence. The first years of their marriage were peaceful, but not monotonous. There was an invisible connection between them that needed no words. They weren't a couple who thrived on public declarations or excessive promises, but rather, they were committed to each other's actions. Ethan worked in graphic design, spending hours in front of the computer fine-tuning details that no one but him noticed. Claire taught literature at a local school and always returned with funny stories about her students, which she shared between bites of dinner. To anyone's eyes, they were the kind of couple who had found that rare balance between love and togetherness. There was no shouting, no drama. Just a lightness that is often mistaken for eternal stability. Over time, a routine took shape. Schedules fell into place, responsibilities were divided almost naturally. He spent mornings at home, she left early to teach. At night, they would reunite with a discreet kiss and the usual question, "How was your day?" It was a choreographed dance, with neither of them realizing they were becoming increasingly mechanical. But even so, there was still affection. There was still that calm way of being with each other, of understanding each other in the touch, in the pause, in the look that lasted more than a second. There was still an us there. Ethan was never one to complain about his life. In fact, he took pride in that peace. He'd learned to love the little things, the way she hummed unconsciously while cooking, the way she read passages from books aloud, wanting to share with him phrases she found too beautiful to keep. She had a light soul, full of passion for the world, and that, to him, was fascinating. Even on days when everything seemed to be going the same way, there was a kind of quiet gratitude for having someone like her by his side. He didn't say it every day, but he showed it. In the coffee he made before she woke. In the way he adjusted the blanket over her on cold mornings. In the attention to the little things. Claire, for her part, was restless inside, though she tried to hide it. She loved Ethan sincerely, but sometimes she felt trapped in a tranquility that made her question if that was truly all there was to feel. She didn't say it out loud. She kept these doubts to herself, like someone who keeps secrets out of shame of discovering their truth. When I looked at him, I felt tenderness, but sometimes I wanted to feel dizzy. An abyss. Something that would take her breath away, like in the books she read. It wasn't that she didn't love him, it was that she wondered if love was enough when her heart still yearned to discover what else there was. These thoughts came and went. Usually, she pushed them to the back of her mind, convincing herself it was just the influence of the exaggerated romance novels she read or the conversations with friends who said marriages always grow cold. And so she clung to the certainties she had: he was good, faithful, kind. He never made her cry, never made her doubt. But inside, something stirred. A longing for novelty, for feeling discovered again. It wasn't a lack of love, it was a lack of surprise. What she didn't yet know was that, by seeking that surprise outside, something in her would be lost forever. However, in the days before the first visible crack appeared, life still went on as normal. She graded papers on the couch while he made coffee. They argued about which series to watch. They planned a trip for the end of the year. They shared their shopping lists on their phones. Small disagreements arose, of course, as in any relationship, but nothing serious. He thought she was more distracted. She said it was too much work. He noticed her hugs were lasting less. She blamed fatigue. And so they piled up excuses, without realizing they were also piling up the distance between them. Ethan wasn't naive. He sensed something was changing. But he trusted her. And trust, for him, was like breathing, natural, necessary, unquestionable. He believed all relationships went through phases like this. That passion changes colors, but remains. That mature love was this, staying even when it wasn't exciting every day. He believed the important thing was the daily choice to stay. And he chose Claire every day. Even when she didn't seem to notice. Even when she no longer smiled with her eyes. On Sundays, they still walked together around the neighborhood, sharing ice cream and talking about houses they'd like to own someday. There were still touches. There were still gestures. But in some of them, there was an absence he couldn't quite name. It was like kissing someone who had already left but hadn't yet announced it. Even so, Ethan continued to believe it was just a phase. That their love would endure. That they just needed time, a trip, less work, more ease. He made plans. She, excuses. What Ethan didn't know was that, as he tried to hold together the world they'd built, Claire was beginning to look outward. Not with malice. Not with anger. But with that naive, dangerous curiosity that often precedes bad choices. And there, amid the ordinary days that passed unnoticed, their story began to tilt toward what would become the breaking point. But no one noticed. There was no betrayal yet. There was no breakup yet. There was no hurt yet. Just a growing silence between two people who once chose each other with such certainty. And when two souls who loved each other so deeply begin to lose each other without realizing it, it's not the noise that betrays the fall, it's the silence. That silence that begins small, like a natural pause, but grows until it takes over everything. Until the two no longer know how to reach each other. Back then, before their world fell apart, they still laughed together. They still shared a bed. They still wrote notes tacked to the fridge. But the story, once written with love and promises, was beginning to be rewritten by averted glances and unspoken desires. And this new story would come with scars, with words that hurt more than silence. It wasn't yet visible. It was still just a whisper. But the end, when it begins, always has this way of seeming like no big deal. Until it's too late to go back. In that phase when time seemed to move faster, as if the days were slipping through her fingers with no one able to hold them back, Claire began to lose herself. It was an almost invisible process, camouflaged by routine, by responsibilities, by small commitments that, at first, seemed merely common distractions of everyday life. She remained there, beside Ethan, in the same spaces, with the same words as always, but something inside her began to yearn for more, and no longer in the sense of grandeur, but in the sense of feeling. She wanted to feel alive again, and that, little by little, became more important than any stability she had built. Her heart, once so present and surrendered, now felt restless. There were nights when she lay beside him and stared at the ceiling, feeling an emptiness she couldn't name. Their shared bed seemed too big for the two of them, and the silences between one conversation and the next became too long to seem natural. Ethan, for his part, continued to believe it was just a phase. He wasn't a man of confrontation, but rather of silent constructions. He reinforced his love with simple gestures, with attention, with presence. He didn't realize, at that point, that her absence was no longer physical, but emotional. Claire was there, but no longer whole. Her absence manifested itself in hurried responses, in glances that fled, in touches that lasted less than before. Even so, he tried. He organized dinners at home, left sweet notes on mirrors, suggested short trips to reconnect. But each attempt was met with a subtle barrier, an excuse, later, a maybe. And little by little, his love became something solitary, like watering a plant that's no longer rooted. It was in this space of unspoken dissatisfaction and doubt that Claire reconnected with an old college friend. Someone she hadn't seen in years, but who appeared by chance on social media with a harmless message, the kind that begins with, "Remember me," and ends by opening doors that should have remained closed. At first, the conversations seemed harmless. A few memories, inside jokes, life updates. But there was an underlying tension in the exchanged words, a curiosity disguised as nostalgia. Claire found herself eager for the messages. She waited for them. She looked for excuses to start a conversation. And before she knew it, she was already thinking about him in moments that once belonged to the couple she shared with Ethan. It wasn't love, it wasn't a deep connection. It was excitement. It was the glow of something new. It was the illusion of a feeling that made her heart beat faster, with no sense of permanence. She didn't stop to reflect on what it meant. She just followed the impulse, pushing away any thoughts that might engulf her in guilt. She told herself it was nothing. That it was just a friendship, a light exchange, a breather. But deep down, she knew. She knew she was crossing a line. And she kept going. The first time she lied to Ethan was a normal Friday. She said she was going out with her schoolmates for happy hour and might be home later. He didn't suspect anything. He wanted her to have fun, as he always did, and stayed home preparing the dinner he planned to share with her on Saturday. While he cooked, smiling at the memories of learning that recipe together, Claire put on her makeup in front of the mirror in an unfamiliar bathroom, with the same delicacy with which she had applied her makeup for him so long ago. And the cruelest detail is that she thought of Ethan that night, not with remorse, but as if comparing feelings. And in that silent comparison, she allowed herself to go. Their encounters became frequent. Always shrouded in secrecy, surrounded by carefully crafted lies. She changed small habits, changed her perfume, made non-existent commitments, left her cell phone face down. Every time she returned home, she found Ethan with the same calm smile as always, and it began to bother her strangely. There was a conflict within her, between the desire to experience the thrill of the new and the weight of destroying everything they had built. She knew Ethan didn't deserve it. But still, she went. And the more involved she became, the more emotionally distant she became from the home she once called refuge. Ethan began to feel the distance more clearly. She no longer commented on her day, didn't laugh at the same jokes, didn't look him in the eye with that old sparkle. There were touches that felt forced, kisses that felt obligatory. And even without proof, something inside him began to unsettle. It wasn't jealousy, it was intuition. An uneasiness that grew with each new excuse she offered. He tried to talk calmly, asking if everything was okay, if there was something he wasn't seeing. She denied it, smiled awkwardly, and said she was just overwhelmed with work. He wanted to believe. He needed to believe. But he began to observe more. The signs were everywhere. Small details that didn't add up. Half-spoken sentences. Awkward smiles on the phone. Distant glances during dinner. And then, one random morning, she let the other's name slip in a stray sentence. Nothing too direct, but enough for Ethan to register. And from that moment on, his senses sharpened. He began to remember the outings, the new clothes, the delays, the excuses. And everything began to make sense. Still, he didn't confront her right away. He wanted to be sure. And as contradictory as it seemed, he still hoped he was wrong. He wished his mind was creating stories, that his insecurity was lying to him. But deep down, he already knew. The truth hurts long before it's spoken. And in every silence between them, she screamed. The confirmation came by chance. A message that appeared on her phone screen while Claire was in the shower. Ethan wasn't the type to go through her things. But that morning, her phone vibrated with a notification, and he instinctively looked. He read just one sentence. Simple. Clear. Irrefutable. And everything he feared materialized in short words. His heart beat slower in that moment. He didn't scream, he didn't cry, he didn't explode. He simply felt the weight of a certainty he'd rather not have. When she came out of the bathroom, he watched her for a few seconds. She greeted him with a kiss on the forehead, as if everything were normal. And he responded. He said nothing. He simply decided he needed to act. That night, as she talked about how tired she was and flopped down on the couch, Ethan watched her with a heavy silence. He memorized every gesture, every word, like someone watching the end of a movie knowing the next scene won't feature the same characters. He wanted to scream, but chose to smile. He wanted to ask, why, but opted for silence. When she asked if they could go out for dinner that weekend, he said yes. And that was when she took the most dangerous step. She asked permission. She wanted to have a special dinner with someone else, she said quietly, as if it were a harmless request. Something light. Just a conversation. Ethan smiled. Not because she found it funny. But because in that moment, everything inside him died. He calmly replied, "Sure, enjoy it, it'll be your last as my wife." And he left. He left without listening to what she had to say. Without waiting for an excuse. Because there was no more room for explanations. That night, Claire was silent. Unsure of what to think. For the first time in weeks, he felt fear. And deep down, he knew, something had been broken. But he still had no idea what was to come. And Ethan, on the other side of that door, walked with his eyes fixed on what would come next, because the pain he felt now would only be the beginning. What he didn't yet know, was that the worst was yet to be revealed. Claire spent the next few days in a state of restlessness she had never experienced before. She wasn't sleeping well, her appetite fluctuated between excessive and completely absent, and her thoughts were jumbled in frustrated attempts to justify what she had done to herself and, more than that, to understand Ethan's reaction. That phrase, spoken with a piercing calm, echoed in her mind like a belated warning of everything she was about to lose. There was no argument, no fight, just that one phrase, "Enjoy it, it will be your last as my wife." She expected everything but that. She expected anger, tears, a loss of control. But the absence of all of it was even more devastating, like an abyss opening silently beneath her feet. And for the first time, Claire felt the true weight of what she had done. The lightness she thought she was seeking by breaking out of her routine with Ethan became an anchor that now dragged her down. Her lover, until then a source of excitement and novelty, began to feel more and more like a mirror of emptiness. The conversations were shallow, the encounters carried an urgency that never evolved into depth. It was a place where desire existed, but love did not. It was the following week that everything began to unravel more clearly. Claire tried calling Ethan several times, but he didn't answer. She sent messages, but the responses, when they came, were dry, objective, with no room for conversation. The distance he'd placed between them was definitive. It was as if he knew any attempt at dialogue would simply be a way for her to alleviate her own guilt. And he wasn't willing to be complicit in a relief he didn't deserve. So she waited. She tried to fill her time with work, but everything seemed to lose its meaning. The students, once a source of joy, now seemed distant. The books, which had always saved her, seemed to mock her reality. And then, driven by a disordered need to make herself understood, she decided to go to their house. She knocked on the door as if asking for shelter in a storm. Ethan opened it, stared for a few seconds, and, without saying a word, made room for her to enter. The house was the same, but everything in it felt different. Colder, more organized, more distant. It was as if every object had already been relocated to a new life. Claire walked slowly to the living room, where she sat on the same sofa where they had so often curled up together, watching movies and napping hand in hand. Now, sitting there alone, she felt like an intruder in a place where she no longer belonged. Ethan remained standing, watching her as if observing something from afar, in no hurry to approach. Claire tried to begin, but her words tumbled over one another. She apologized. She said she didn't know what she was feeling, that she was confused, that she never meant to hurt him that way. Ethan, silent, listened. His face was impenetrable. When she finished, he expected some reaction, a scream, a wail, a plea for him to leave. But what came was far worse. He sat across from her and said firmly, without hesitation, "You destroyed something that took years to build in minutes. And it wasn't with what you did, it was with how you did it. The betrayal didn't start with the kiss, it started when you stopped seeing me as someone worthy of being chosen." Claire began to cry. She begged for a chance to explain, saying she could see clearly now, that she was sorry. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment and sighed. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, but each word was a punch. "You know what's worse? It's not just losing you. It's knowing that the love I gave you wasn't enough for you to even hesitate before throwing it away." She tried to reach out, to touch his hand, but he recoiled. And that was when the truth Claire hadn't yet known was coming began to take shape. Ethan got up, went to a drawer, and returned with an envelope. He handed it to her with steady hands. Claire, confused, opened it. It was a printed letter. At first, she thought it was something emotional, a message from him to vent. But as she began to read, her face changed. It was a transcript. A dialogue. Words she had spoken to her lover. Exact words. Intimate words. It was as if she were reliving every moment. Words that could never have come out of that place, that she never imagined could be read by anyone other than the person standing in front of her that night. Her heart raced. Her hands trembled. She looked at Ethan in shock. He remained silent, watching. The sentences printed on the paper left no doubt. They were conversations she'd had with her lover, recorded in audio, converted to text. Laughter, confessions, comparisons between the two, phrases as painful as knives. He's so predictable, always trying to please, or, with him, it's like being alive again, something I haven't felt in a long time. Each line was a stab to her own conscience. Claire covered her face with her hands. How had it gotten this far? Ethan then explained, with a coldness only those who have suffered in silence know. The man Claire had the affair with ran a podcast about modern relationships and couple dynamics. It was popular on social media. It sold the idea of emotional freedom, of experiencing life, of living guilt-free. And, unbeknownst to her, he used the affair with Claire as an example in a special episode about fake relationships, omitting names but describing the encounters in enough detail that anyone in her circle, upon listening, would know exactly who it was. The podcast had been listened to by thousands of people. And a friend of Ethan's, who worked in marketing, recognized the story and immediately alerted him. He listened to every second. Without saying a word, simply absorbing the pain of seeing the intimacy of his own life exposed as entertainment. Claire froze. Her hands gripped the paper tightly, as if trying to tear reality before her eyes. She babbled that she didn't know, that she would never have consented, that it was crazy. But none of that mattered anymore. Her image was tarnished not only in Ethan's eyes, but in everyone's. Her mistake, once private, was now a public narrative. And the worst part wasn't the exposure, it was knowing she'd been discarded by someone who didn't even care about the consequences. Someone who disappeared without a reason, who deleted messages, who never answered another call. She traded a home for an adventure, and ended up becoming content. Ethan, seeing the despair on her face, simply said that the real problem was never the other man. The problem was that you believed you needed more than you already had. That the simple, real love I gave you was not enough. You didn't just cheat on me with me, you cheated on the woman you used to be. Claire cried, kneeling on the living room floor, unsure of how to proceed. Her voice came out in whispers, I'm sorry, please. I loved you. I just wanted to feel something new. I didn't know I was going to lose everything. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, like someone listening to an old song that no longer hurts as much as it used to, and replied, You didn't lose me when you got involved with someone else. You lost me the moment you stopped fighting for us. She begged to stay, said she needed time, that she could still win him back. But he got up, went to the door, and opened it. Without shouting, without accusing. He simply made it clear that she was now a visitor. That what was home had become an address. That what was love had become a memory. And that, no matter how much she forgave, she would never return. Claire left in silence, carrying with her the weight of a choice that destroyed everything that had once sustained her. Outside, the world went on as normal, but inside, everything had fallen apart. And Ethan, still standing in the doorway, looked up at the afternoon sky and took a deep breath. He felt neither relief nor anger. He felt a kind of mature sadness, the kind that comes when we understand that not all love is enough to keep two people together. And that sometimes, loving someone is precisely knowing when to let them live with the consequences of their own choices. What he didn't yet know, is that life had something more in store for him. Something that, even after so much pain, could still completely change the course of his life. Claire left that house without direction. The streets seemed colder than the weather actually suggested. She carried the crumpled envelope in her hands, as if clutching the paper was the only thing keeping her connected to some part of reality. The world around her continued to spin, people smiled in cafes, cars passed at intersections, but inside her, everything had stopped. She felt disfigured inside, as if there was no longer any possible way to shape what had once been her life. What devastated her was not just the loss, but the way everything had been exposed, dismantled, dismantling her along with it. She had always imagined that if something went wrong, there would still be dignity to mend. But now it was only shame, abandonment, and the echo of her own guilt. In the following days, Claire retreated into herself. She cancelled classes, avoided friends, and turned off notifications. She tried to find a hiding place in solitude, but discovered that where there was no distraction, the only option was to confront herself. The podcast, now shared on forums, social media, and groups, portrayed her as a caricature, the woman who betrayed her kind husband for a passing pleasure and became a joke. Some knew it was about her. Schoolmates, old acquaintances, even more attentive students began to distance themselves, as if she were carrying some kind of contagion. She tried messaging the man with whom she had the affair, demanding explanations, trying to understand how he had the courage to expose her that way. He saw it. He didn't respond. He blocked her. And that digital silence was the final signature of neglect. Claire, now isolated, returned to her parents' house, a place she never thought she would need to return to. Her mother's pitying looks, her father's resigned silence, the restrained gestures of someone trying to support her but unable to hide their judgment. The house that had once been a haven now seemed more like a reminder that she had regressed, that she had failed not only as a wife but as a woman. The nights were long, filled with insomnia, guilt, and flashes of memories that haunted her. Ethan standing in the doorway. Ethan telling her she had betrayed the woman she used to be. Ethan holding a piece of paper that was worth more than any explanation she could offer. And worst of all, he was right. She knew it with cruel clarity. While Claire grieved silently, Ethan carried on. Not coldly or insensitively, but with the sobriety of someone who knew he could no longer carry the debris of a love that no longer existed. He tidied the house, got rid of objects that belonged to the couple, and redesigned spaces. Each change was a symbolic way of affirming that the chapter had closed. He received support from a few close friends, but avoided talking about Claire. Not out of hatred, but because he needed her to stop being the protagonist of his present. One cloudy afternoon, he accepted a friend's invitation to participate in a charity meeting hosted by an NGO that supports emotional health. It was something simple, but new. And at that event, he met Ava, a volunteer with a calm gaze and a low voice, who spoke with a serenity he hadn't heard in a long time. Ava didn't know his story. And perhaps that's why it was so easy to talk to her. Ethan felt at ease, without needing to defend himself, without needing to explain his wounds. The conversation flowed naturally. She didn't ask invasive questions, but listened with genuine interest to every detail he chose to share. Her gaze pierced him not as judgment, but as presence. There was no rush, no immediate exchange of contact information. But there was a reconnection with something he didn't know he could still feel, peace. And peace, after all, was the purest form of love he could ever wish for. In the days that followed, they met again. Coffee, walks, shared silences. Ava didn't invade their space, but filled it with kindness. Ethan laughed again, not out of obligation, but because there was room for lightness. There was no talk of love, no future plans. They simply lived moments with the awareness of those who have learned, through pain, to respect time. Months later, on an autumn Sunday, Claire appeared again. This time not to beg, but to ask for forgiveness with a less desperate, more devastated look. She was different. Thinner, quieter, more exhausted. Ethan opened the door and, even though surprised, allowed her to speak. They sat on opposite sides of the room, like two strangers who had once been everything to each other. Claire took a deep breath before beginning. She said she expected nothing from him. She didn't want to return, didn't expect reconciliation. She just needed to say that she finally understood the extent of what she had done. That she spent months wondering what was missing, when in fact everything she needed was already there. That she sought excitement and found emptiness. That she traded an entire love for a broken mirror. She said she had learned, in the cruelest way possible, that love doesn't have to be euphoric to be true. And that betrayals, even when forgivable, are not always recoverable. Ethan listened attentively. There was no more pain in his eyes, only a mature calm. He thanked her for coming. He said forgiveness had been granted long ago. That he held no hatred. That she was part of a story he didn't deny, but that it was just that, a story closed. He told her he was starting over. Not in a rush, but with sincerity. Claire smiled through her tears, telling her that was all she needed to hear. That he was right to follow. That she hoped one day she could do the same, even if she never found anyone like him again. As she left, Claire felt a strange lightness. There was still pain, of course. But there was also something she hadn't felt in months, acceptance. Acceptance that the consequences couldn't be reversed. That some loves don't return, but that doesn't mean they weren't real. She walked to the street as if she finally understood that the greatest betrayal she'd committed wasn't against him, but against herself. For not appreciating what she had, for seeking in uncertainty the adrenaline she should have cultivated in security. As Ethan closed the door, he took a deep breath. He felt at peace. Not because of her pain, but because he realized that, despite everything, he'd made it out whole. Not just intact, but stronger. And when he returned to the living room, he found a message from Ava saying she was passing by and wanted to know if he'd like to go for a walk. He replied yes, and minutes later they were walking together under the orange autumn leaves. There were no vows, no promises. There was silence, complicity, respect. And maybe that was love. Or the beginning of a new one. The story between Claire and Ethan ended there. No shouting, no scenes. Just with the maturity few endings possess. She moved on, rebuilding herself. He moved on, finding love again in the most serene way possible. And looking back, they both knew, through different paths, with different burdens, that love, to last, must be chosen every day. And when it isn't, one day it simply stops being there. The silence that followed that last encounter between Claire and Ethan wasn't oppressive, nor was it empty, but it carried a kind of weight that exists only between two people who loved each other deeply and no longer belonged together. There was no longer any anticipation, only a bitter, almost resigned acceptance that time had done its work, and now, all that was left was to move on. Ethan, as he closed the door, felt neither immediate relief nor euphoria at having so firmly closed a cycle, but rather a dense sensation, as if he had crossed a minefield and finally reached the end of the road, wounded but alive. He wasn't proud of the pain Claire carried, nor did he take pleasure in watching the consequences she herself had brought unfold before her. It wasn't revenge, never had been. What he carried now was simply a full awareness that he had done everything in his power, and that, still, it hadn't been enough. And that, deep down, was the scar that was hardest to accept. The weeks passed with a gentle slowness. Ethan dedicated himself to rebuilding his routine, this time without having to deny himself or measure his steps. His conversations with Ava became more frequent, but unhurried, without demands. It was a connection that required no leaps in the dark, no proof of fidelity. Their time together was filled with sincerity and a kind of quiet maturity that only arises after pain. Ethan still didn't call it love, because now he was careful with his words. He knew that feelings, no matter how real they seemed, needed space, observation, time to grow beyond the shaky ground of need. But what he felt with Ava was light, honest, and indistinguishable from what he experienced with Claire, not because it was better or worse, but because it was different. And it was new. Claire, meanwhile, was trying to reconfigure her own identity. She was alone. And not physically, but emotionally. For the first time in years, she saw herself as helpless. Friends quietly drifted away, social media conversations dwindled, and glances at the grocery store or on the streets she used to frequent carried judgment, even when they weren't spoken. And though she tried to move on with dignity, there were nights when she lay in bed and thought about everything she'd lost. Not just Ethan, but the woman who stood by his side. That confident, secure woman who felt sufficient within a relationship that embraced her. She had deconstructed this woman with her own hands, and in trying to reinvent herself in the name of a fleeting desire, she lost not only his love but also her self-esteem. She tried to fill the void with other connections, other conversations, even other attempts to reconnect with parts of herself she'd thought were lost. But everything seemed tasteless, meaningless. The phrases she'd once exchanged enthusiastically with her lover now sounded banal, artificial, almost childish. The memories of the encounters no longer provoked shivers, but a bitter shame that she avoided revisiting. It was on a quiet Sunday that she decided to delete all the messages, all the photos, everything that connected her to that part of her story she no longer wanted to carry. It wasn't a symbolic gesture of starting over, but an act of survival. She now understood that she couldn't rebuild herself while still feeding on the remnants of something that had never been whole. The podcast, even though it had faded over time, still left traces. And these traces lived on in the imagination of those who knew her, even if no one else commented openly about it. There was no way to control the narrative others constructed about her. All that was left was to patiently rebuild her own narrative, even knowing that, for many, she had already been labeled forever. As Claire faced the ghosts of what she left behind, Ethan slowly allowed himself to smile lightly again. Ava didn't pressure him. She knew that some pains don't end when the story ends. They become echoes that, from time to time, still resonate in everyday life. But what existed between them was care. On one of their walks in the park, he told her for the first time about the betrayal. Not the details, but the pain. Ava didn't interrupt. She just listened. And when he finished, she held his hand firmly and said that no one is defined by the pain they carry, but by the choices they make after it. Ethan didn't respond immediately. But that phrase stuck with him for days. The moral of what happened, for him, was never about not trusting anyone anymore. It was about learning to recognize the signs, about understanding the value of reciprocity and commitment. It didn't matter what he felt alone, but what they could build together. And now, for the first time, he felt he no longer had to walk alone. Ava was different. Not because she made him forget Claire, but because she reminded him of himself before the pain. With her, he rediscovered his own presence, his own voice, his own worth. It wasn't a replacement, it was a rebirth. Yet something was still unresolved. Ethan, though he harbored no resentment, still harbored a final doubt that hammered silently within him. Not about the past, but about Claire's perspective. He wondered if she had truly understood everything. Not just what she did, but why she did it. And if she had somehow managed to rebuild herself, not because she wanted to go back, but because she needed some peace in knowing that the chaos she created hadn't swallowed her whole. And this uneasiness, though subtle, nagged. Then the unexpected happened. At a cafe, while reading a book Ava had recommended, Ethan found a letter discreetly left on the next table by a server. He said it had been delivered by a woman days earlier, with the request that it be delivered if a man with his characteristics appeared. Ethan was surprised, but immediately recognized the handwriting. It was Claire's. The letter wasn't a plea. It wasn't an attempt to win him back. It was an outburst. A confession. There, with direct and vulnerable words, Claire laid out her process of rebuilding. She spoke of the pain of looking in the mirror and not recognizing herself. Of the weight of waking up every day and facing the fact that she destroyed what she loved most out of impulse, pride, or need. She said she discovered, too late, that mature love is silent, discreet, and requires courage to not give up. That her love for him existed, but was immature. That she always expected him to save her, when it should have been her own safety. And she concluded by saying she no longer sought redemption, but only the assurance that he was okay. That he was the great love of her life. And that, if she had ever doubted that, today it was the only indisputable truth she carried. Ethan finished reading the letter in silence. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket, not as if he wanted to keep it close, but as if he knew there were parts of life that shouldn't be torn up, just filed away. There, he understood that not all pain needs to be resolved. Some simply need to be accepted. The dilemma that had previously troubled him dissolved in the clarity that their story had served its purpose. And that each of them now lived with the consequences of what they had experienced, and what they had failed to experience. That same day, upon seeing Ava again, Ethan hugged her tighter. He said nothing about the letter, because he didn't need to. Some stories are concluded with words. Others, with gestures. He knew that what he held in his hands now was different. It was solid. And he no longer needed answers from the past to live in the present. Life, there, began to reorganize itself in new forms. And even without eternal promises, there was something immensely valuable, the certainty that, no matter how much love may be destroyed, the heart is capable of beginning anew, as long as one consciously chooses who to let in after the pain. And that choice, now, was his. That afternoon, after pocketing Claire's letter and walking slowly along the sidewalks already slightly damp from the autumn drizzle, Ethan felt something he couldn't name, a mix of relief and regret, like finally closing a heavy door that had been left ajar for too long. But unlike the other times when the past returned like an anchor, this time there was a final point. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't resentment, it was acceptance. The letter didn't bring him answers he didn't already know, but it confirmed that, ultimately, each of us followed the path we needed to follow. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The answer lay in his current life, in the choices he was making and the peace he was slowly building, not like a new castle, but like a simple, solid home made of truths. Ava noticed the difference in his gaze that night, when they met for dinner at the discreet restaurant where they usually shared quiet moments and light conversations. Ethan didn't mention the letter, but there was a deeper, more focused silence, as if something inside had been put back together. Ava didn't ask, but watched him with the patience of someone who understands that there are times when love simply needs to bide its time. When he wordlessly touched her hand across the table, she responded with a slight smile. Nothing more was needed. Days later, an unexpected invitation arrived for Ethan. It was from a former publisher he had collaborated with years before. They were putting together an anthology of personal reconstructions, real stories, with first-person narratives, written by those who had intensely experienced moments of rupture and transformation. The proposal was for him to write a chapter. Initially, he hesitated. He didn't like the idea of revisiting it publicly. But upon closer inspection, he realized that perhaps this was the final layer to be peeled back, not as an exhibition, but as a testimony. Something that could, in some way, touch others trapped in similar situations, believing there is no life after a broken heart. In the days that followed, Ethan began to write. He didn't rush. Each paragraph was constructed with an honesty that sought not revenge, but understanding. He recounted the relationship, the moments of silence, the nearly invisible cracks, the shock of discovery, the pain of the collapse, the cruel absence, the weight of public exposure, the loss of himself, and finally, the slow and painful process of finding himself again. And, between these lines, he recounted how, despite all the wounds, it was possible to relearn to love. To love differently, with more awareness, more listening, more presence. Ava was mentioned, but with the delicacy she deserved, as the person who didn't save him, but who offered him the space to save himself. As she wrote, Ethan realized how much she had changed. The man who began that story was someone who believed love was enough. The man who now finished it understood that love, without presence, without dialogue, without mutual and daily choice, is nothing more than intention. The publication was finished weeks later, and upon reading it, she felt no pain, she felt pride. Because now, what had once been a tragedy had become a testimony. Of loss, yes, but also of a new beginning. Claire, on the other hand, was trying to shape what life she had left. She continued living with her parents, but now she was looking to get out more, to regain some of her autonomy. She began attending an emotional support group for women who had been through difficult relationships, not as a victim, but as someone who had caused the pain, and who needed to take responsibility. There, I spoke little in the first few weeks, but listened a lot. And it was by hearing other stories of pain, of abandonment, of new beginnings, that she began to recognize her own wounds more clearly. Not as an excuse, but as a warning. One day, she shared her story for the first time. Her voice was firm, but her eyes were welling up. She said she cheated not out of malice, but out of need. And that the greatest betrayal she committed was against her own intuition, for not confronting the voids that existed within her before seeking to fill them outside. The women in the group listened silently. None judged her. Some identified with her. And Claire understood, then and there, that starting over required first acknowledging her shadow, and living with it. It was during this period that she discovered Ethan's book by chance. A friend from school commented on social media. Her name wasn't mentioned in the project, but the story was so clear that she couldn't help but recognize herself. She spent days debating whether to read it or not. When she finally did, alone in her room, she read it in one go, unable to put it down. And when she finished, she cried. Not with regret, but with gratitude. Because Ethan hadn't reduced her to a mistake. He hadn't portrayed her as a villain. He narrated the events with dignity, without sparing the pain, but also without erasing the affection that existed. This helped her understand that he truly forgave her. Not out of blind kindness, but because he understood that forgiveness was the only way to free herself from the past as a prison. Weeks later, they ran into each other by chance in a bookstore. She was in the philosophy section, he in the history section. Their eyes met, and time froze for a few seconds. Claire smiled first, a small, almost shy smile. Ethan returned it. They didn't hug. They didn't immediately approach. But their eyes said it all, "We're fine now." She walked toward him, walking with measured steps. They talked about simple things. The book. The day. The bookstore. And then she thanked him, for the way he wrote. She said that, more than anything, she felt seen. And that, even though she'd made a mistake, she didn't want to be remembered only for that. Ethan nodded and said he'd never write a story where someone was just the mistake they made. Because in the end, everyone has something greater than their flaws. When they said goodbye, there were no promises of friendship, no exchange of phone numbers. Just a wave and a mutual understanding that this story had ended as it needed to, with truth. Ethan left the bookstore feeling light. Ava was waiting for him outside, checking her phone with the same ease as always. Seeing him, she smiled. He approached and hugged her. And in that gesture, Ethan realized he was no longer a man rebuilding, he was whole. Not immune to pain, but no longer a prisoner of it. There were no leftovers. Only lessons learned. Time, no matter how painful, always provides answers. Not always the ones we want, but almost always the ones we need. And as they walked down the street together, dry leaves crunching under their feet, Ethan understood that not all love stories last. But they all leave something, and sometimes, that something is exactly what prepares us to finally live the life we deserve. Months had passed since their last meeting at the bookstore, and the world seemed to have finally found its axis again for each of them. The story, once full of anguish and misunderstandings, now balanced between endings and new beginnings, even though no one had planned them that way. Ethan, over time, allowed himself to live the new with more abandon. With Ava, he felt a different stability than the one he once sought with Claire, not because she was perfect, but because she wasn't fragile. The conversations were sincere, the silences were no longer uncomfortable, and moments of uncertainty were resolved through dialogue, not distance. He had learned that a healthy relationship isn't one that lives without flaws, but one that chooses to face each crack with genuine presence. And it was precisely this constant choice that led him, a year later, to propose. There was no spectacle, no elaborate speeches. Just a look, a gesture, and the question asked with trembling hands, not out of fear of the answer, but out of respect for the weight of that moment. Ava said yes, and in that moment, Ethan knew, he had finally found a safe love to call home. The wedding was discreet, intimate, surrounded only by the few friends who remained and a few family members who had witnessed the pain and now celebrated the new beginning. There was no invitation to the past, not out of resentment, but because some pages, once turned, should remain closed. During the ceremony, as he held Ava's hands, Ethan realized that this story wasn't about forgetting Claire, but about being able to move on even after being broken. Loving again wasn't a replacement, but a construction. And that new home he now shared with someone who saw him whole, without ghosts, was the most solid proof that some scars don't deform, they just remind us of where we don't want to return. Claire, on the other hand, still struggled with the remnants of what she'd destroyed. Life didn't reassemble itself as easily. After the exposure, the fall, and the loneliness, she tried a series of paths that always seemed to lead her back to the same point, a broken reflection in the mirror. She still taught, but with less brilliance. Conversations with colleagues were polite but cold. Social invitations became rare. She constantly struggled to prove she was okay, that she'd learned, that she'd overcome. But deep down, I knew better. Shame was still a silent companion, manifesting itself at the most inopportune moments, when listening to a song, when passing a place where she'd laughed with Ethan, when crossing paths with an acquaintance who knew the story. At one point, he tried to connect with someone else. A kind, sensitive man who cared about her ideas and showed genuine affection. But Claire no longer knew how to receive affection without fearing it would reflect what she had lost. It was as if her very presence was tainted by guilt. He couldn't give himself completely. He was afraid that by trusting again, he would disappoint someone again. And this became a cycle that kept her trapped. The more she tried to start over, the more she felt she was still living in her own shadow. He decided to walk away from relationships. He opted for a simpler, more private life, focusing on volunteer work and writing. He began keeping a journal, where he recorded thoughts, lessons learned, and pain. And there, he found a way to release some of what he was carrying. Not to forgive himself completely, but to understand that true forgiveness might never come from another, but from herself. Years later, Claire published a small, independent book about regret. It didn't mention names or explicit details, but those who read it carefully understood that it wasn't fiction. The book went unnoticed by most, but for a select few, it made an impact. Women who saw themselves in that mirror. Some who made the same mistakes. Others who almost did. And it was in this silent exchange with strangers that Claire found a thread of redemption. Not the kind that wipes everything clean and erases the past, but the kind that shows that, even after everything, it's still possible to build something from the rubble, even if it's never the same again. And then, at a small literary event, Claire saw a poster announcing the presence of a guest author, Ethan. He would be launching the third, revised edition of his book, now translated into other languages and recognized in reader circles as one of the most sensitive works on pain and overcoming. She didn't go up to him. She watched from afar. She saw him talk to readers, smile, sign autographs. She noticed Ava sitting beside him, with the same calm look as always, a small child sleeping on her lap. And in that moment, Claire understood that he had built the life she had once prevented from happening alongside her. She didn't feel envy. She felt sadness, of course. But also a certain relief. Because, despite everything, he was happy. And perhaps that was the only ending she still needed to accept. Later, when she got home, Claire wrote the last page of her new diary. She said she still blames herself, that she still misses who she was with him, but that she no longer tries to cling to what never returns. She said she saw him, and that he was at peace. And that, even if she never finds what she found, she is also at peace knowing that love, despite everything, survived in him. And that, somehow, she was a part of that too. Ethan, at that very event, never knew she was there. But that day, as he loaded his daughter into the car and looked at Ava laughing with the child in her arms, he felt a silent gratitude for everything he'd experienced. Including the pain. Because she was the one who taught him to love with his feet on the ground and his whole heart. He knew that what he had now wasn't a made-up happy ending, it was real. Made of hard choices, painful sacrifices, and a silent faith that something good could still come after the storm. And it did. If you've followed this story this far, you've certainly felt the weight of every choice, every regret, every step lost and rediscovered. Now, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Comment below. Your opinion is very important and can help others reflect as well. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, designed to move, provoke, and transform. And remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys respect, trust, relationships, and sometimes entire futures. True love requires conscious choices every day. And when betrayed, there's always no going back. The channel does not, under any circumstances, support any form of betrayal. Here, the moral will always be clear: what is built with loyalty cannot be ruined by fleeting impulses. Until the next story. May it find you whole.